It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS, AM 1160, 101.1 FM, and our conversation with Ryan Swanson, the author of The Strenuous Life, Theodore Roosevelt, and the Making of the American Athlete, is brought to you by Marcus & Mack, a law firm representing injured people. He is Ryan Swanson. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you on the air with us today. I was telling you before that I've always been a great fan of Teddy Roosevelt literature because it's such a rich history. And so you have written this book. And, you know, right now we would be watching baseball. We would be enjoying the basketball tournament. The sports whole landscape has been interrupted by this COVID-19 thing. But, you know, we wouldn't be doing this. We wouldn't be waiting for all of this sports activity and watching it and making it such a big part of our life if it were not for Teddy Roosevelt, would we?
Yeah, that's right. And that's the argument I make in the book, you know. And if we think about, you know, the way that we're all stuck in our homes now and really, you know, there's obviously this whole health and economic crisis going on. But as we look, as sports fans, you know, we look out at the landscape, like you said, and there's all these rights of kind of our sports calendar, you know. But the NCAA, you know, plays a big role in spring with the March Madness tournament. And then, you know, fall rolls around and we have the World Series and the Olympic Games, which, of course, you know, was just announced that, you know, they'll be postponed a year. Yeah, those are all traditions which were set in place during Teddy Roosevelt's era. He didn't control everything, of course, although he tried to. But it's kind of this watershed moment of change right at the turn of the 20th century, which really sets in place these sports traditions that kind of guide our lives.
And while he may not have been the leader of the movement, he certainly was the leader of a physical movement here across the nation, across the Americas, because at that time, it was an odd time in history because of technological advances, changes in industry. We were basically becoming a really lazy society when Teddy came along, weren't we?
Yeah, we were. I mean, well, things were changing. You know, at the turn of the 20th century, it's the time when there's kind of these couple of tipping points. It's the time when more people, you know, about more than 50% of Americans are living in cities. And most people are taking jobs as employees, sometimes in factories and otherwise. And so the way that everyday life is working out for many Americans is changing, you know. And there's a real concern that, Americans are getting lazy, they're getting fat, they're not living life the way that their ancestors had. And so there's a real concern that there's going to be, you know, pretty serious effects. And so sports become an answer to that problem, you know. It's the progressive movement as well. So there's kind of a desire to have all kinds of answers to these questions, so that sports becomes part of it. And I would say it's, I think, kind of similar to the way we talk about things today. I'm a parent of 3 kids, and among parents, you hear this discussion, oh, our kids are playing too much Fortnite and too many video games. They're too soft. They're too this or that. And so I'm going to stick them on a soccer team. And so, there's some continuity in that angst, I think. But certainly, you know, there's a big change in society when Roosevelt is president, and so sports becomes an answer.
He becomes sort of a maniac about it too. He was not a healthy child. He had a very sickly childhood, and one day he just determined, or at some point in his life, this isn't going to be the way it is with me. I'm going to turn myself into basically an animal here, and because of it, he adopted a mindset that sort of swept through once he became the president of the United States.
Yeah. You raise a good point. I mean, I think Roosevelt's story, his childhood is really important. When he is a kid, he has terrible asthma, and to the point where he can't be in school. He kind of lived the way we are living now. He was housebound for much of his early years, and about age 13, his father calls him into the family library. They're a very wealthy family, and he sits down with him, and they have a heart-to-heart talk. And his dad basically says, you know, I'm proud of you. You're smart, but you've got the mind, he says, but you've got to make your body. And he, you know, as a father, challenges his son basically to fix your own asthma, which, you know, doesn't seem entirely fair to me. But Roosevelt takes the challenge. He says, I will make my body. And from there going forward, he sees physical fitness and sports as the way to get out of that. And, you know, in Roosevelt's mind, something miraculous happens. He gets better. And what we know now is that it's pretty common for kids in their teenage years to kind of age out of the worst of asthma. But for Roosevelt, it's really all about his exercise and sports. So as he heads on into his life, he will always hold sports out there as the answer. You know, I did it. I was sickly, and I exercised, and I got better. Then, when he becomes president, he'll say that about the nation. Exercise more, be more athletic, be more strenuous, and you'll get better too as a nation. So yeah, he kind of sets that mindset when he's in his early teen years.
Ryan Swanson is our guest. We're talking about his book, Theodore Roosevelt and the Making of the American Athlete. So his family, obviously, he gets them onto it. And pretty much anybody who shows up at the White House or at the Roosevelt House, you'd better bring your sneakers. You'd better be ready, because if you're going to the White House and Teddy Roosevelt's there, you're going to do a hike and you're going to play some tennis. You're going to do something physical.
Yeah. I mean, it was really, I love those stories, actually, as I was researching for this book. You find all these incidents of, this ambassador or this civil servant showing up to the White House, assuming that it's going to be a meeting. And the story starts to get out, later in his years, but especially in his early years in the White House. They'd show up thinking, we're going to have a meeting, it's going to be really serious. And Roosevelt would be kind of walking them towards his office, and he would shift the conversation to tennis or hiking, or, if he could get any indication that they were at all interested, he'd say, perfect. Grab my rackets, let's play a couple sets of tennis, even though it's August and, Washington, D.C. in August, is a swamp, basically. Or let's head out for a, point-to-point hike of 7 miles. And so, yeah, he surprised a lot of people with these excursions, medicine ball time on the White House lawn, tennis. But it was a way for him to kind of connect mind and body. And it was a way that he worked out a lot of political problems. He eventually, there about 35 men become known as part of his tennis cabinet. And these were younger men who were part of the D.C. scene who would come and play tennis with him, lift weights with him, box with him, run with him. And it was really an important group for Roosevelt in terms of making decisions.
I think it's kind of interesting, too, that his good friend at the time, William Howard Taft, is definitely not in that group.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, Taft has different priorities and different ways of doing things. And Roosevelt himself deals with weight his whole life. Not quite to the extent that Taft does, but they have different views on these kinds of things.
One of the things that I really enjoy about the book is we get to meet so many people, and Teddy Roosevelt seems to surround himself with, and if he doesn't know a particular athlete or entertainer, he makes it a point to get to know them, and this all plays into it. You tell some great stories about him, athletes, and celebrities.
Yeah. I mean, Roosevelt's a really curious mind, is one. As I was working, on this project, I was trying to get to the core of Roosevelt, as so many people have. A lot's been written on Roosevelt, obviously. But he's so prolific. He writes 150,000 letters during his lifetime. He has 30 books. He just is curious about everything. And in the world of athletics, that absolutely plays out as well. So he invites different people to the White House, different boxers, different athletes. John L. Sullivan, for example, becomes a friend of Roosevelt's. And Roosevelt's always curious to kind of get their perspective. He has a wrestler come at one point, ostensibly to teach his boys some moves. But, it takes like 5 minutes before Roosevelt's in there himself trying to make sure he's got the moves too, So there's a lot of interesting people. And he's very much, he thinks through things by bringing people together. He doesn't do it by himself. And so that brings him into contact with a lot of really fascinating folks.
And of course, he very famously, as some have said it, he saved football. Without him, there is no football happening in this country.
I mean, so I didn't mean to interrupt there, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than saving football. But he gets involved, and so I try to tell that story in the book. Because he's a football parent himself. His son Ted Jr. is playing at Harvard at the time, which is roughly equivalent today if President Trump or President Obama before that had a son playing at Alabama or something like that. It was big-time football. So, yeah, he gets involved and helps football kind of save itself.
Ryan Swanson, our guest here this morning on Indiana in the Morning. We have just a few minutes left with him. The book that Ryan has written is a fascinating one. It's all about Teddy Roosevelt. It's called The Strenuous Life, Theodore Roosevelt, and the Making of the American Athlete. Tell me about how you sourced this thing, because you really get into some stories that we've never heard before.
Yeah, I just tried to dig as deep as possible. So, like I said, Roosevelt's written all these 150,000 letters. So as many as I could, I went through his letters. But from there, I went into the archives. Harvard University has a massive Theodore Roosevelt collection. The Library of Congress and National Archives as well hold records. The challenge was that in telling his story about sports, You had to kind of tell the story of football and tell the story of the Olympic Games and tell the story of the rise of tennis. And so it was really a wonderful project, but I found myself kind of going to different repositories and archives kind of in these different sports worlds to try to pull up records. And what I found was so many sports and so many kind of athletes and sports leaders had some connection during this time to Roosevelt. They'd exchanged letters, or they'd gotten a piece of advice, or Roosevelt had come to one of their football games. And so I just tried to kind of dig into each of these little worlds and find stories that could be pulled together in what I hope is one kind of consistent narrative talking about the rise of this strenuous life.
You can find the book, The Strenuous Life, Theodore Roosevelt and the Making of the American Athlete by Ryan Swanson, practically anywhere. Ryan, what are some of the resources? What are the sites we need to know about?
I mean, in terms of getting the book, it's sold anywhere books are sold, so Amazon's an easy place to get it, as well as Barnes & Noble or the independent bookstores. If you want to look at some more of my writing, you can look at ryanswanson21.com. But basically, I wish people, to stay well during this really interesting time. And if they're interested in a book about sports and Roosevelt, I think this is one they'll enjoy.
It's a good read. Ryan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank you.